Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Reading Michael Jackson. I am your host, Lena, and once again, I am so happy to be here with you today for another episode. Last week's was a doozy. I mean, it was so long. I am determined to not be so long this week with all of my thoughts and feelings and unrelated sharing. But I do want to start off this episode this week with a very brief reflection on a book that I just finished reading. So in addition to reading books about Michael Jackson, obviously, I read things other than things related to Michael in general, but as another way of getting to know Michael, getting to learn more about him and his philosophies, I like to read books that I know he read and that he enjoyed. And what's really cool is in the Michael Jackson Book Club, the Facebook group, which I highly recommend joining if you're not in there already, in that club, there are all kinds of guides to books that Michael had read himself and that we know he enjoyed. And one of those books is a book called The Power of Positive Thinking, written by Norman Vincent Peale. Now, this is a book that I had on my list for a while, and then I found randomly in a used bookstore. I've been carting it around for a couple of years now, and I finally read it. And it's a really fascinating book. Now, I really like books about personal philosophy and books about how to live a more grounded and peaceful life. I find it really useful to hear these recommendations. And because I admire so much about Michael's perspectives on life and the philosophies that drove his choices, I really like to learn about what could have potentially influenced him. Now, this was a book that was published originally in 51 or 52, so it's pretty old at this point. And it's written by, I believe, a minister. So there is a very strong Christian ideology in this book. If that is not something you're comfortable with or not something you're interested in, then I probably wouldn't recommend this book. But I grew up Christian and I have some adjacent kind of beliefs to it. And like I've said, I'm not a practicing Christian, but I'm not uncomfortable with it either. So I read this book, and aside from some, I'll admit, some problematic views that are very out of date, I was really struck by how progressive this felt and how in line it feels with a lot of, honestly, more like Eastern philosophy. There was a lot about meditation and mindfulness. There was a lot about what we would now call manifestation or even visualization. There was a lot about that as well. A lot about the importance of prayer or connecting with a higher power in general, that kind of transcendence. But I wrote down a number of the main points I really took from this book, and some of them really surprised me in that they showed such consistency with who Michael was as a person. So, for example, a couple weeks ago for the bonus birthday episode, I referenced an interview that Michael did, and I included a clip from it. And this was an interview from the Thriller era. I think it was like 1983 or something. And from that interview, I included a clip in which he talked about not believing in failure. And that's not a word that he uses. And in this book, there's this whole section on why, I mean, obviously the title, The Power of Positive Thinking, the whole book is about the importance of thinking positively, right? But there's a section that was about specifically not believing in the concept of failure, not allowing negative ideas about how something's going to go or the result of something, not allowing that to enter your mind ever. And obviously that's not a groundbreaking idea. And you'll see that in a lot of like self-help books and things, but it just reminded me of Michael. There's also a section talking specifically about how the most evolved or maybe enlightened individuals will know that to embrace being childlike is like the closest you can get to real peace and real tranquility in your life. And it goes on about the importance of trying to view the world in a childlike way and trying to see life through the eyes of a child. There's a whole section on that. And of course, that is in line with a lot of the things we've read here. And I just found that really cool. I mean, I enjoyed the book just personally, which was the main reason I wanted to read it, to be honest. But in looking at that in tandem with who Michael was, with the fact that Michael did read this book, did cite this as a book he enjoyed or got something from, and then you see some of the writing he does here, I can't help but think, oh, wow. So this book, who knows when he read it? I mean, it was out before he was born. Who knows when he read it? He could have read this as a boy, as a teenager. He could have read this right in advance of writing his manifestation notes for himself. It even talks about affirmations in this book. So just really interesting. And I thought I would share that with you all in case it would interest you. So with that said, I am going to jump into this next episode, but I just wanted to share it because I thought a cool connection to Michael, and it was a really good book. So there you go. Again, a couple of things I would not stand by, but it was written in the 1950s, so I can kind of, I keep that in mind when I deal with it. But for now, let's get into this week's episode. I'm hoping to not cry this week. I feel like I've been highly emotional the last few weeks, and I would like to keep it together a bit more. So we are going to continue with what is actually the start of part 2 of Dancing the Dream, which I find kind of hilarious because we are nearing the end of the book itself, but we'll talk about that. And this is also a companion piece to one of the pieces we read in the very start of part 1. So I now invite you to relax, get comfortable, get cozy, and join me for this reading of Magical Child, Part 2. Magical Child. Magical child once felt a twinge, a faint recollection, a memory unhinged. In the colors, the form, the hue, there seemed a mystery with a subtle clue. Behind the wind, the storm, the gale, within the shroud, beyond the veil, hidden from view in a wondrous pattern, there seemed a force he could not fathom. Its music and cadence were playful and sweet. He danced in bliss to its throbbing beat. He did not mind either cold or heat. On the mountain high was his royal seat. Strangers came and scorned his joy. With ridicule and banter they tried to destroy what in their minds was a skillful play. With cruel darts they tried to plunder, to suffocate and strangle his innocent wonder. Fighting hard despite their blunder, again and again to steal his thunder. Despite their attacks they could not break, with all their barbs they could not take. God's gift of love, which they could not fake, not knowing his strength or what he sought to seek, they complained aloud and called him a freak. But the mysterious force just kept its hold. Magical child grew brave and bold, diving deep into his soul. In exquisite ecstasy, he discovered his role. In his self was infinite scope. This mysterious force was mankind's hope, piercing through the mask of being. In that silence, beyond all seeing, was a field with a different story, a field of power, of awesome glory. With other children, it unfurled. Its tidal wave would change the world. Magical child was ready to bow, sow the seed, pick up the plow. with effortless ease, without a sigh, without a tear, without a cry, with silent perfection, under God's direction, to sing together as one race, stem the tide, transform this place. Magical children, don't worry how, don't delay this moment's now. Well, I must confess, I am already afraid. This is going to be longer than I want it to be. I'm so sorry. I will do my best to be succinct, but I cannot help it. There's just so much to say already. So, of course, this is Magical Child, and it is the second piece in this book titled Magical Child. It has similar themes as Magical Child from the first part. In fact, let's very briefly review the Magical Child poem that is included at the start of part 1. So looking just very briefly at the first iteration of Magical Child, you can see there's these very consistent themes. A magical child, a magical being with this inner wonderment and joy and innocence, spreading love and being judged by the world and being held to an impossible standard by that world, being destroyed in some ways by that world. But this magical child, this magical being, having a kind of resilience to continue to march forth in what he knew he wanted and needed to do, and closes with this kind of reminder that this magical child exists inside of each one of us, and why we need to hold on to and maintain that part of ourselves in order to find peace in the world. Finally ending with this reminder: deep inside, you know it's true. Just find that child, it's hiding in you. So this is what set off our entire book. And then as we went through the rest of the book, up until this point, we had a number of pieces about so many different aspects of life, but many of which continue with the thesis of maintaining your inner child, taking action now, doing something with that inner child, protecting that innocence, finding it, cultivating it, nurturing it. And so when we get to part 2 and our second version of Magical Child, which, by the way, this is very small, but both pieces are titled Magical Child. And in the first piece, the word child is italicized, while the word magical is not. And in the second piece, the one we read for today, the word magical is italicized and the word child is not. So that makes me think that the focal point of the first piece was about the child part, and the focal point of the second piece is the magical part. So first, perhaps embracing the child part of ourselves, and then coming to understand that that part of ourselves is magical. Just a thought. Either way, we get to this second version of Magical Child. And there's a similar narrative here, right? But it ends, as so many pieces do in this book, with a different kind of call to action, where the first piece ended with find the child inside of you. This piece ends with a now do something about it. And I find that kind of interesting. So a lot I want to say about the piece. Let's just read through it and have a discussion of the different sections that I noted of interest that I think could be revealing to us. And then we'll conclude with a kind of implication for all of this. So because this isn't a particularly short poem, I mean, it's not long by any means, but it's not like extremely short. I'm not going to reread each of the sections, but I want to jump around and we'll go in order still. So in the first verse, it starts with magical child once felt a twinge. And I want to start with that line because The first poem is more about establishing who and what the magical child is. And by this point, we already know. We've spent a book understanding the magical child. So we get to this, and we can kind of assume there's this understood magical child, this magical being inside of all of us, but perhaps in this case, a very specific one. This one perhaps being more focused on Michael specifically. Magical child once felt a twinge. The magical child character is established, so we are now acting on our understanding of that character. So this character once felt a twinge, and within him, a faint recollection, a memory unhinged, the mystery of life behind the wind and the storm. So a force he couldn't fathom that was playful and sweet and musical. So I see this almost as the magical child's discovery of life in the meaning of everything, and perhaps the discovery of purpose. So I see this whole first stanza as being about his introduction to an experience of falling in love with music and finding that purpose and feeling a sense of peace and joy and connectedness with that. So within that, he was free and at peace. But from that moment, he's then introduced to strangers who come and scorn his joy. With ridicule and banter, they tried to destroy what in their minds was a skillful play. And I thought about that line a little bit, and I was trying to understand what he meant. And I could be misreading this, but the way I'm reading this right now, what he's saying is strangers, so perhaps the media, trying to destroy or target that wondrous childlike side of himself that was in their minds a skillful play. So perhaps in their mind a performance, perhaps in their mind fake. So Michael being made fun of in the media for being childlike, for being soft and gentle and interested in children and animals and, things that are not traditionally associated with men or male interests, and being ridiculed for that, perhaps in part because they saw it as fake. And maybe that's what he's suggesting here, is that people thought it was a performance of some kind. And perhaps what he's suggesting here is that it wasn't. I'm not sure if that's what he means, but that's kind of how I interpreted it here. With cruel darts, they tried to plunder, to suffocate and strangle his innocent wonder. But despite their attacks, they could not break. With all their barbs, they could not take God's gift of love, which they could not fake. Not knowing his strength or what he sought to seek, they complained aloud and called him a freak. I mean, there's simply no way to not see Michael writing about himself here, right? I mean, he was called a freak as early as the mid to late 80s, despite the fact that he was extremely beloved, extremely popular, highest selling artist, the most popular, famous person in the world. I mean, he was famous and deeply, deeply loved, but the media did not reflect that. And I often seek out publications and media from the 1980s, especially because it's the time period of Michael's life I'm the most excited about. And so I like to see, what were people saying about him? Now, obviously, I've heard people say that there were questions and rumors about his sexuality and whatnot back in the 1970s when he was still like a teenager. But even in the thriller era, 1984, the Time cover story with the Andy Warhol portrait of Michael on the cover, in that cover story, there are so many backhanded compliments or backhanded comments about his weirdness or strangeness. In one hand, they call him sexy, and in the other hand, they talk about him being this man-child and very weird and bizarre. And that's during the time when he was untouchably famous and popular with the general public. So by the time we get to the later 1980s, when his appearance changed a bit more and he kind of restyled and rebranded himself for the bad era and introduced himself to the world with a slightly lighter skin tone and with a different hairstyle and some different cosmetic changes, I believe the media took those changes as an opportunity to hurl insults at him and attack him. Not because he was actually doing anything that strange or that problematic, and certainly not because he looked weird, because it's a pretty popular opinion that he looked phenomenal during that time period, but because they could, because there was an opportunity to, because when someone physically is changing, it's kind of an opportunity to change the narrative about that person. Either way, my point is, these narratives started when Michael was still so incredibly beloved. And then by the time this book came out, Michael was really in a way at the height of his commercial success. I mean, Thriller, yes, was like the huge moment we think about, but if you look at even like his growing net worth over the period of his life, I mean, the Dangerous era was one of the most profitable times in his career. He was on everything. He was on covers of everything. He was performing a lot in public. He was on tour. He was winning awards. He was a Grammy legend. You know, he was, all these things were happening to him at this time. But he was still being called a freak all the time. The tabloids would publish photos of him calling him a freak. So, I mean, it's the word choices here in this piece are very clearly geared toward describing his experience. And I want to come back to that actually toward the end of the piece, but for now, let's just continue with the review. He goes on to say, but the mysterious force just kept its hold. Magical child grew brave and bold. Diving deep into his soul, in exquisite ecstasy, he discovered his role. And this I see as this kind of beautiful form of resilience in Michael. So rather than being dragged down by the constant media scrutiny that he received, he dug deeper and he leaned in hard to understand himself and remind himself and realign himself with his purpose. And with his purpose being, as he goes on to say, to change the world, to transform this place. There's these lines I really love. He goes, this mysterious force was mankind's hope, piercing through the mask of being. I really love this part because what this whole section reminds me of, where he's talking about getting this gift, experiencing this gift, being ridiculed, and then reaffirming himself in what he knows his purpose is. It reminds me of the stories about like prophets and saints. Like I thought of Joan of Arc, you know, receiving a message from God and then acting on it and believing in a steadfast way that was her purpose and her mission in life. It reminds me of that, where Michael believed that this gift he was given, these gifts, not just in terms of his talent, but in terms of the messages he was meant to transcribe and pass through humanity, was ultimately about hope for mankind, piercing through that mask of being. And I see piercing through the mask of just being human. I mean, if you talk about life from a spiritual perspective, we're all souls. We're embodying these physical forms that make us think we're these human beings and we have these human egos and these human concerns. But in reality, in the actual infinite truth of the universe, we're souls. And we're souls that are seeking our divine purpose. And that's what I see him saying here. And I love it. I love it so much. And I see just such passion and such bravery in what he's writing here, to affirm this belief about yourself to the world, especially a world that is laughing at you or ridiculing you. And I mean, again, Michael was, even at this point, the most popular entertainer in the world. It is not like the world didn't love him, but the media certainly tried to paint a picture as if he was not deserving of that love and praise. I mean, it's just, they did, and there's no denying that when you look back at the work coming out at that time. And something I find so incredible is how when you look at Michael's work like this piece and the pieces throughout this book, as well as obviously his music, and you see the consistency of his messaging and what he was trying to achieve and do, and you look at the media that was coming out around him about that time, if you are a spiritual person or if you are a religious person, you might be able to look at that oppositional media as almost like a dark force that was working to upend those efforts on his part. Like these were opposing forces that he was fighting against. And I know that sounds a little grandiose, and maybe people are a little uncomfortable with framing it in that way. But I think if you look at his goals and his messaging, and you look at the life he led in representation of those beliefs he had, I mean, he was not a person that just sort of talked and didn't do anything. He really did represent his beliefs about life. He really did try to spread messages of love and unity and innocence and working on behalf of the world and the children of the world and protecting animals and the environment. I mean, he lived his life in an authentic way as connected to those ideas. So I just wonder, I often think, God, when we look back at this era of human history in 100 years or 200 years, and there are things written about Michael Jackson, will there be a different narrative? And will we look at what he was doing and saying and how he was being represented in the media and see much more clearly than we can now even how much there was an obvious effort to dismantle his efforts? He says, with other children, if unfurled, its tidal wave would change the world. So I see this in a way of him talking about himself as a magical child and with other children that he could connect with. And I don't think that means children in terms of age, but in terms of the inner parts of all of us. So that reference to children includes adults. With connection to all of us, if all of these messages become clear, it could become a tidal wave of changing the world. And I really believe that was his goal. He finishes with silent perfection under God's direction, to sing together as one race, stem the tide, transform this place. Magical children, don't worry how, don't delay, this moment's now. And I see that ending as him, again, making a direct reference to us, whereas initially in the first piece in the book, he's trying to bring us on board for this perspective. We're all magical children. I am, you are. Let's find the child in ourselves. And by the end, he's saying, I am this magical child, and you are all magical children, and let's embrace who we are. Let's embrace what we know is the truth about life and about living, and let's change the world. There's no time to wait, and there's no reason to be ashamed. The time is now. And it's inspiring. And I was thinking about recently what draws us so strongly to Michael Jackson. And I won't say that I ever necessarily felt like a misfit in life, but I have felt periods of not feeling understood by anyone, or like I was somehow alone in the world. And I think there's something about Michael and these messages that really connect to people who have struggled with that particular feeling and challenge. And I see him really representing that here. What I love about this piece is that I think it shows a lot of growth for Michael, from going from a place of being really pained by the world and their rejection of him in a lot of ways, and the media kind of harming them, to becoming a person with a real armor on, where he could say, I can do anything in spite of what you say because I know my purpose, and I know that God is behind what I do, and I know that I am operating with a divine sense of what needs to be done. And that transformation of an insecure person who is pleading and struggling with the world to a person who is embracing this part of who they are and their purpose, and kind of writing off the world and really only focusing on the children. And again, children could be all ages, because if you look at the way Michael views life and the way he's talking about what it means to be this magical child, it's the internal part of us. So connecting with us in this way. I want to close with something that this entire piece made me think of. It is a note that Michael Jackson wrote and was published in an October of 1987 issue of People magazine. And this is a note that was handwritten, and the handwritten note itself was published in People. And it is a heartbreaking note, but is so resounding in what he is saying here. And I just want to read it to you if you're not familiar with it. In this note, he writes, like the old Indian proverb says, don't judge a man until you've walked 2 moons in his moccasins. Most people don't know me. That is why they write such things in which most is not true. I cry very, very often because it hurts, and I worry about the children, all my children, all over the world. I live for them. If a man could say nothing against a character but what he can prove, history could not be written. Animals strike not from malice, but because they want to live. It is the same with those who criticize. They desire our blood, not our pain. But still I must achieve. I must seek truth in all things. I must endure for the power I was sent forth for the world, for the children. But have mercy, for I've been bleeding a long time now. This note, I said I wasn't going to get emotional. I said I wasn't going to get emotional. It is difficult to not get emotional when talking about this, but this note, I think, really represents exactly what this entire piece, I believe, is about. But perhaps in this time when he wrote this in 1987, perhaps it was more raw for him. Perhaps he had not come to bear it in the same way. Perhaps he simply wanted the world to understand him more. I read a note like that and I think, my God, Michael, you were too good for the world. I mean, a world that is so unwilling to listen to meaning and nuance and depth. And Michael is here writing a letter with these beautiful sentiments and this whole idea of those who criticize desire our blood, not our pain. I'm just thinking about that. It's almost like he's saying they desire proof we were hurt, or proof we can bleed, or proof we are human, proof that we are weak, but they're not thinking about the pain they're causing. I think that's how he means that. So when he says at the end, I'm going to continue forward, but I've been bleeding a long time now, he's saying, you're not going to stop me. I'm going to continue, but please consider the pain you are causing me. Please consider the way I'm bleeding. And what really breaks my heart about it is that the press made fun of him for this note. I mean, this is a note of kind of confession. It's a note of tremendous vulnerability, and he was made fun of for it. And what I think is unfortunate is that because of Michael's success, he doesn't come across as an underdog. This is a man who at this point in 1987 had the 2 biggest selling albums of all time in Thriller and Bad. He was the biggest star in the world. He was music's first billionaire, as I heard in a documentary. He was huge. So to call him an underdog, he was not an underdog in a way that the world would understand that term to mean. But because of that, I think his success is part of what made people comfortable making fun of him, because it's like, oh, go cry in your billions of dollars, go cry in your, beautiful ranch, go cry in all of your gold records. And that is an attitude a lot of people have about celebrities or about anyone with wealth, that their problems aren't real. But when you look at someone like Michael, his problems and the way that he was treated was abuse. I mean, there's no way around it. It was absolutely abuse. And it breaks my heart to think he was calling out for a kind of compassion from the world and was mocked for it, you know? And it just makes me think, God, what kind of people are behind these decisions? You know, what kind of people are behind the decisions to mock a person when they're literally crying out and saying, please stop. I'm bleeding too long. I'm bleeding too much and too long, you know? So with that said, this was a really interesting piece, I think, to kick off what is part 2. Again, it's funny that this is part 2 because we have like 7 or 8 pieces left. So I don't really know what the thinking was behind that. Perhaps as I read the rest of part 2 and complete the book, I'll think on that more. Like what differentiates this part 1 from part 2. Perhaps he feels, he made the case for this whole inner child thing by the time we get to the end of part 2. So he's able to reignite the conversation with another version of magical child. I'm not sure. Either way, thank you so much for joining me today and for listening to this whole episode. If you did, I look forward to being with you again next week. In the meantime, have a wonderful week and weekend, and we will talk soon. Take care.